The paper I would like to discuss with you today is a part of a larger project concerning the implications of the basic liberal commitment to equal respect for persons in terms of the treatment owed to minorities in a liberal democracy. And this general project has in particular focused on the relations and on the compatibility, both conceptual and normative compatibility, between the commitment to respecting persons on equal terms on the one hand and practices and policies of toleration on the other. In this paper, I concentrate on a specific practice of toleration, which I take to be particularly interesting, and especially from the perspective of the European project of integration, which is one of the themes of this conference, has not been sufficiently debated, and this practice is the cultural defense. So the idea that the cultural reasons for certain crimes should be discussed and allowed in courts in order to establish the degree of the defendant's responsibility. There's a large debate in the US, there's been debate in the UK, but I think that in continental Europe this kind of debates still need some kind of precision and deepening. So I hope I'll contribute to this project. In particular, the paper is structured more or less into three parts. The first part, I'll try to give you some working definitions of the idea of respect with which I work and that of toleration. In the second part, I shall try to draw some general ideas in terms of the general compatibility of the idea of respect and practices of toleration, and then in the third and last part I will focus specifically on the cultural defense as a practice of toleration and try to discuss its compatibility with the basic commitment to treating all persons with equal respect. Before I get started, one caveat, that is I shall not offer any argument for the idea that a liberal democracy is a form of government grounded in the principle of equal respect for persons. I shall just take that as a starting assumption, but of course you are free to question when we get to the discussion of over lunch, which is probably more likely. So, point to in your handout. The idea of respect with which I work is borrowed by Stephen Darwall's famous account of recognition respect, and on this account the principle of equal respect for persons requires that someone's moral status as a person be reckoned with while interacting with her. So in order to recognize persons, to respect persons, we should recognize their moral status, their moral personality when we decide how these persons must be treated, how we must relate to this person. This idea of respect is somewhat standard and mainstream idea in liberal philosophy. I think is a good way to characterize the sense in which we owe respect to persons as persons. However, thus characterized is an idea that cannot really make sense of the reason why the persons owed to persons must be equal. This is a famous criticism of the idea of respect, which was proposed by Bernard Williams, among others. And here the idea is that if respect is the appropriate response to persons' moral personality, and the moral personality of persons depends on their possessing certain morally relevant property, if we look for what this morally relevant property is, a possession of which demands respect, we will end up seeing that people possess whatever morally relevant property at very different levels. So on a Kantian reading, if what grants dignity to persons and then demands respect is the capacity for rational thought, and we look at how people are actually rational in their thinking, then we see that we'll have different degrees of rationality. And, well, I think that the recent outcomes of the Italian elections show pretty well that certain people are just not rational at all when they act in politics to start with. And I promise I won't complain about the Italian elections anymore from now onwards. how do we find a reply to this problem? I think a very interesting reply has been recently proposed by my friend and colleague Ian Carter, who in a recent piece that came out in Ethics tries to specify the property, possession of which confers dignity upon persons and therefore demands respect, in terms of a range property. So following John Rawls, as is well known, a range property is a property that past a threshold a person is taken either to possess or not. So if we conceive of moral personality as a range property, and we think that persons all possess the basic scalar agential capacities over which the range property of moral personality supervenes to a minimum extent, and then we focus only on the range property of moral personality, we must conclude that this property is possessed equally by all persons, and therefore all persons are worthy of equal respect. The appropriate understanding of respect in response to this kind of understanding of moral personality was termed by Carter in terms of opacity respect. So when we recognize persons as the bearers of moral personality, understood as a range property, the appropriate way in which we should treat persons is as if they were opaque to our judgment as regards the exact level at which they are situated above the threshold of moral personality. Any variations of the scalar properties of agential, of agency above the threshold are morally irrelevant. What is morally relevant and that people possess, and they are standardly taken to possess, the minimum of agential capacities which is required to qualify them as moral agents. This does not mean, of course, that we should refrain from entering this kind of judgments, because quite plainly that is not possible. But what opacity respect demands as a political principle is that we refuse to consider, that we restrain ourselves from considering the judgment of persons' agential capacities above the threshold as a valid reasons to establish how this person should be treated. Okay? So opacity respect demands that we treat all persons equally in qua persons, and we refrain from taking our judgment of their variable agential capacities as a valid basis to establish how they should be treated. Okay? And this implies that all of them should be treated as equals. As I said, opacity respect, thus understood, is not taken to be an appropriate idea characterizing any kind of interpersonal relations, but it's taken to be an interesting idea, and I think pretty strong idea, to characterize relations in politics and society, both vertical relations between institutions and citizens, and horizontal relations between citizens qua citizens and not as friends or relatives or work colleagues. Okay? So I think this idea of respect is particularly interesting because it seems to capture the egalitarian basis that distinguish a liberal democracy from other forms of government, and therefore I propose to focus on this idea of respect as a benchmark to discuss the acceptability of different policies and practices of toleration. The idea of toleration with which I work, on the other hand, is much easier to characterize than the idea of respect, so I'll be much shorter and certainly less confused on this, because I take a very standard concept of toleration, which I take to be compatible with any possible conception one may have, either traditional ideas of toleration as forbearance or more recent positive and richer idea of toleration and recognition. I'm interested in the concept of toleration, and is characterized at point 3 of your handout. A tolerates B if and only if, despite A's dislike or disapproval of a feature X of B, and there is either actual or potential power to interfere negatively with X, A refrains from interfering negatively with B's X. Okay, so I take this to be a fairly standard definition of toleration. Now, second part of the presentation is toleration. Are practices of toleration, so conceived, generally compatible with the basic commitment to treating persons with respect, as I characterized it earlier. I think here are twofold replies necessary, and that's detailed at point 4 in your handout. I think that on general terms, if we take respect in terms of recognition respect, and here I'm saying nothing very original, it's a view that has, for example, been recently championed by Rainer Forst, but was also discussed by Thomas Cullen. Toleration is not only compatible with respect, but may be taken to be grounded in recognition respect. So the reason why we tolerate persons despite our disapproval or our dislike for what they do or think is because we recognize them as moral agents, and by virtue of their possessing moral personality, we refrain from interfering in what they do, despite our negative judgment of what they do. And in this sense, we consider persons as responsible for their actions, as an entailment of their moral agency, moral personality. However, I think that there are certain practices of toleration which are incompatible with certain understandings of respect. And in particular, I think that relations of toleration that are informed by or imply a kind of negative judgment that is prevented by opacity respect are forms of toleration that are quite problematic to justify in a liberal democracy. As an example of a case of toleration, which is a quite standard case of toleration, which involves the kind of negative judgments that are prevented by opacity respect, is the case of Muslim women's veil wearing, either wearing a hijab, niqab, let alone a burqa. So Muslim women's agential capacities to make rational choices is often disputed in these debates and also in policies addressing the issue in regard to their wearing of veil, because this practice is considered the result of a male-dominated cultural brainwashing that negatively affects their capacity to make autonomous choices. Such a judgment of Muslim women's agential capacities is part and parcel of the objection that gives rise to toleration. Okay? So we object to the practice of Muslim women wearing a hijab or a niqab, also, not exclusively, but also because we think that Muslim women have been coerced into wearing this or that, and in so doing we question their agential capacities. So the basic idea is that if they were in full possession of their agential capacities as anyone else, they wouldn't have decided to wear a hijab or a niqab and so on and so forth. So insofar as judgments, I'm not arguing that all judgments of toleration involve such a kind of objection, but insofar as judgments of toleration, as practices of toleration, imply or are grounded in this kind of negative judgment of the tolerated agential capacities, then this kind of judgments are prevented by opacity respect, and therefore these practices of toleration, if are grounded in these terms or considered in terms, are not acceptable in a liberal democracy grounded in the idea of respect for persons. Okay? So how all this general reasoning relates to the problem of the cultural defense? Well, the cultural defense, I think, is one of those practices of toleration which involve this kind of judgment of the agential capacities of the tolerated, that is the defendant. And indeed, the cultural defense has been quite often questioned as a disrespectful practice in a liberal democracy, of which we should be wary. So in order to give you a better idea of my reasoning, let me give you a brief definition of the cultural defense that you can find at point 5 in your handout. We have a cultural defense when members of some minority group appeal in court to their cultural traditions as at least a partial excuse when charged of some offense they carried out in good faith following a cultural practice. And the cultural defense, I think, can easily be seen as an instance of toleration following the concept of toleration I outlined, because despite the negative judgment of the culturally motivated offense on the part of the majority, the offender is tolerated insofar as he or she is not treated as an ordinary criminal, but rather at least partially excused for the offense. Now, And here's the central question which I'd like to address in the time I still have left. Should the cultural defense as a practice of toleration, so conceived, be ruled out in a liberal democracy, committed to treating all members of society with equal respect? Point 6 of your handout. To treat persons with respect standardly entails that persons should be treated as responsible for their beliefs and actions, as an entailment of what I said earlier, of the idea of recognition respect. Moreover, opacity respect requires that such a treatment be extended to all persons equally, without making it dependent on any judgment of their actual agential capacities beyond the threshold of moral personality. However, treatment in accordance with the assessment of such capacities and of the extent to which they are burdened by the defendant's cultural commitments is precisely what occurs in legal courts when the cultural defense is adopted. The point of the cultural defense is precisely to enter in this kind of judgment of the level at which the agential capacities of the defendant were burdened by their cultural commitments. So should we conclude that the cultural defense is unacceptable in a liberal democracy committed to the principle of respect for persons? The reply I shall give you is twofold and is in the negative. But before I give you my reply, I think it's necessary to operate a further distinction between two types of assessments of the agential capacities of the defendant that may occur in a legal court. The distinction is at point 7 in your handout. On the one hand, or in the first place, we can be asked to evaluate, to assess the defendant's agential capacities to establish whether a person passes the threshold of moral personality and can therefore be accorded the status of a moral agent and can be considered as capable of taking on some kind of responsibility. Okay? For example, when we are called to issue judgments related to the mental insanity or sanity of a person, we are precisely trying to establish whether we are dealing with a full functioning person or not. Okay? This is one kind of judgment. The second type of judgment we can be asked to carry out in court is meant to establish not so much whether a person is a person, a full functioning person in a fundamental sense, but to assess how this person was actually able to exercise his or her agential capacities above the threshold of moral personality. So it's not an assessment aimed to establish whether this person stays above or below the threshold, but where exactly above the threshold this person stands. Okay? And I think these latter kind of judgments are those standardly implicated in cases of cultural defense, and these are the kind of judgments that raise specific issues of opacity respect. Whereas the first kind of judgments are judgments which raise more fundamental issues of recognition respect of the moral status of persons. And I think that most commentators on this point had in mind the first kind of judgments when they declare the cultural defense as disrespectful of moral personality and treating cultural offenders as incapable of taking on responsibilities. Now, if we take this distinction between these two types of judgment and the two types of respect-related problems they cause, I think we can give a more precise response to the question whether the cultural defense should be ruled out quite incompatible with the demands of respect. In the first place, I think it's pretty obvious from the characterization I gave that opacity respect is violated in courts in any instance of the cultural defense. But I think that it is a violation that is in fact legitimate in a liberal democracy, insofar as the demands of opacity respect can be taken to be temporarily suspended anytime the action of a person violates the liberal rights, the fundamental rights and liberties of others. And when I argue this, I'm not saying anything very sophisticated at all, but I'm simply sort of building on the basic liberal idea that the extent of our non-interference with the practice and actions of others is conditioned and determined by the protection of the liberal rights of other persons. So it's just a very basic liberal claim. So I think that any time a person's action infringe upon, either actually or allegedly, the liberal rights of others, then it is possible to temporarily suspend the demand of opacity respect in order to enter in an evaluation of the agential capacities of this person, which that we continue to consider as a person, of course. There's no questioning of placing this person below the threshold of moral personality. But we want to establish with some precision where exactly this person stands in order to attribute with some precision responsibility to these persons for the violation of the rights of others of which this person is actually charged. And in fact, I think this is what standardly happens in cases of cultural defense. So violation of the liberal rights of others are generally implicated in those cases for which the cultural defense is invoked. Cultural practices ranging from arranged marriages to female genital mutilation to honor killing arguably involve the violation of the liberal rights of others. And in such cases, I think it is legitimate that legal institutions tear the veil of opacity apart and consider how exactly certain cultural commitments have affected the agential capacities of the defendant, as well as the extent to which they should be considered in assessing the offender's degree of responsibility. So in the case of the cultural defense, such an evaluation is part and parcel of a practice of toleration, whereby members of a minority group, when charged with an offense, demand that their culture-specific reasons be heard and considered as a possible attenuating circumstance or an excuse, even possibly as a justification for their behavior, despite the majority's negative judgment of such behavior, and relatedly and quite possibly of the agential capacities of the defendant. Now, if this is true, so if it is actually the case that in cases of cultural defense, the demands of opacity respect are violated, but it is a legitimate instance, this seems to suggest that the cultural defense is not incompatible with the basic demands of respect in a liberal democracy as far as opacity respect is concerned. And I think that the answer in terms of the compatibility between the cultural defense and respect is still in favor of the cultural defense when we come to recognition of respect. And that's the case because violation of opacity respect do not necessarily entail a violation of recognition respect. We have a violation of recognition respect only in those cases in which a person is wrongly placed below the threshold of moral personality, when it's treated as an object or a child or a non-human animal. But that's not really the point in cases of cultural defense. So in general, it's quite a distinctive feature of the cultural defense not to argue for the moral responsibility of the defendant, but try to graduate the extent to which we attribute moral responsibility to the defendant himself. So it seems that the demands of recognition respect remain very much in place during any kind of trial, but in cases of cultural defense in particular, and the articulation itself of the cultural defense should take the demands of recognition respect as a constraint on their features. So, for example, a cultural offender cannot go psychiatric examination in order to establish whether this person is insane or not. But cultural reasons can be admitted in court in order to establish with precision how much they have burdened the capacity for rational judgment of this person. So if all these very quick argument works, I think we can consider the cultural defense as one of those practices of toleration that should find room, that could find room in a liberal democracy committed to the principle of equal respect for persons, because although they constitute a violation of opacity respect, it is a legitimate violation, and they do not represent any kind of violation of recognition respect, in any meaningful term. Of course, it is not an argument for the cultural defense, for the desirability of the cultural defense in general, and there may be many other considerations in terms of the negative impact on the rights of women, for example, that have been often raised in cases of cultural defense. I'm not to deny that these issues are still relevant and may in fact count in favor of restricting or even not adopting the cultural defense. My aim was simply to argue that the cultural defense cannot be ruled out on the basis of its incompatibility with the treatment of persons, as demanded by the principle of equal respect. And I stop here. Thank you.